Elvis calls John live during radio interview. John Lennon's reaction leaves the host silent. The airwaves, an invisible tapestry woven with voices, secrets, and the fleeting echoes of human connection. For John Lennon, a man who had mastered the art of public confession and private enigma, a radio studio was both a confessional and a battlefield. New York, a city that pulsed with a million stories, where legends walked among mere mortals, often burdened by the very crowns they wore. It was a late autumn night, the city outside a blur of neon and rain-slicked streets. Inside the sterile confines of a Manhattan radio station, the microphones glowed, silent sentinels awaiting the next truth, the next revelation. John Lennon sat opposite the host, a seasoned veteran of late-night confessions, his face etched with the weariness of a life lived under an unforgiving spotlight. He was there to talk, to explain, to perhaps, once again, redefine himself for a world that never quite understood. He spoke of peace, of love, of the complexities of fatherhood, and the relentless pursuit of artistic integrity. His voice, a familiar blend of Liverpudlian wit and New York cynicism, filled the studio, carrying his words across countless miles into countless homes. He was the prophet, the rebel, the poet, still wrestling with the ghosts of yesterday, still striving to build a better tomorrow. But even in his most candid moments, there were layers, hidden depths, secrets he guarded with a fierce, almost primal intensity. The interview was a dance, a delicate balance between revelation and deflection. The host, skilled in the art of probing, sought to unearth the deeper truths, the untold stories behind the headlines. John, ever the master of his own narrative, offered glimpses, tantalizing fragments, but always held back the final, most vulnerable pieces of his soul. He had learned that fame was a double-edged sword, offering adoration on one side and a chilling, impersonal hunger on the other. He knew the world wanted answers, but some questions, some burdens, were meant only for the bearer. And on this particular night, as the conversation delved into the isolating nature of superstardom, into the unique burdens carried by those who stood at the pinnacle of cultural influence, an unforeseen tremor was about to shake the very foundations of the broadcast. A call, an incoming signal from a phantom, a voice from a different era, a legend from another kingdom. It was a moment that would shatter the carefully constructed illusion of control, revealing a secret truth about the intertwined destinies of two musical titans, forever bound by the isolating crown of legend. The studio, usually a space for controlled discourse, was about to become an unexpected confessional where the echoes of rock and roll history would collide with the raw, human heart. The studio was a sanctuary of sound, insulated from the city's relentless clamor. Padded walls absorbed the noise, creating an almost monastic quiet, broken only by the hum of electronics and the low, steady rhythm of John Lennon's voice. He sat hunched over the microphone, a cigarette burning slowly in the ashtray beside him, a half-empty cup of tea cooling on the console. His eyes, though often obscured by tinted glasses, held a weary intensity, reflecting the countless battles fought, the endless questions pondered. This was John in his American phase, a man who had traded the manic energy of Beatlemania for a more introspective, yet no less impactful existence. He had found a new rhythm in New York, a city that understood the art of reinvention. But even in this chosen exile, the weight of his past, the shadow of his colossal legacy, was a constant companion. He spoke of his music, his activism, his family, each word carefully chosen, each sentiment imbued with the depth of his complex spirit. He was the poet, the provocateur, the reluctant prophet, still seeking meaning in a world that often seemed devoid of it. The host, a man named David, was a veteran of these late-night sessions, a master of drawing out the guarded truths from the most elusive of guests. He listened intently, his questions precise, respectful, yet always pushing, always seeking to peel back another layer of the Lennon enigma. He understood the delicate dance, the unspoken rules of engagement with a legend. He knew that John, for all his openness, always kept a part of himself locked away, a private chamber where only the most profound truths resided. The studio itself was a microcosm of their world. State-of-the-art equipment, gleaming consoles, a maze of wires and monitors. It was a place designed for communication, for broadcasting voices to the masses. Yet, in its very design, it also highlighted the inherent distance, the one-way mirror between the speaker and the unseen millions. John, more than anyone, understood this paradox. He had built a career on connecting with people, yet often felt profoundly alone, isolated by the very fame that defined him. He spoke of the unique burden of being an icon, of the relentless scrutiny, the constant expectation to be more than human. He touched upon the loneliness that came with such a life, the difficulty of finding genuine connection when every interaction was filtered through the lens of celebrity. He hinted at the unspoken understanding that existed only among those who had walked a similar path, who had worn the same heavy crown. It was a subtle acknowledgement of a fraternity of legends, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of global adoration and profound isolation. And as he spoke, unknowingly, a voice from that very fraternity, a phantom from a different kingdom, was about to breach the carefully constructed walls of the studio, shattering the illusion of control and revealing a truth that would leave everyone, especially the host, utterly silent. The stage was set, not for a performance, but for a revelation, broadcast live to the world. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. The interview flowed, a river of words and reflections, charting the tumultuous course of John Lennon's life. He was mid-sentence, dissecting the complex legacy of the Beatles, when a sudden, jarring sound cut through the air. Not a commercial break, not a technical glitch, but the distinct, insistent ring of the studio phone. The red light on the console, usually reserved for pre-screened calls, flashed with an unexpected urgency. David, the host, frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Apologies, John," he murmured, reaching for the phone. "We usually don't take unscheduled calls during these segments. Must be an emergency." He pressed the button, his voice professional, slightly clipped. "You're on the air. Who's calling?" A voice, deep and unmistakable, filled the studio. It was a voice that had once commanded millions, a voice imbued with the very essence of American myth. A voice that belonged to a phantom, a legend from a different era, a king who had long since retreated from the public eye. "Is John there?" the voice drawled, a slow southern cadence that sent a shiver down David's spine. Tell him it's Elvis." The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. David froze, his hands still on the phone, his eyes wide with shock. He looked at John, who had also gone utterly still, his face a mask of profound, unreadable emotion. The air crackled with an electric tension, a sudden, impossible collision of worlds. John Lennon, the man who had faced down presidents and challenged empires, sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the flashing red light. The name Elvis was a seismic tremor, shaking the very foundations of his carefully constructed composure. He had met Elvis once, a brief, awkward encounter years ago, a clash of two titans that had left more questions than answers. But a live call now, in this moment, was an intrusion of a different magnitude. David, recovering slightly, stammered, "Elvis? As in Elvis Presley?" "The one and only, son," the voice on the line confirmed, a hint of amusement in its depths. Now is John there, or ain't he? The host, a man who had interviewed presidents and movie stars, was utterly speechless. His mind raced, grappling with the impossibility of the situation. Elvis Presley calling live during a John Lennon interview. It was beyond surreal, beyond any script he could have imagined. This was not just a call, it was an event, a moment that would redefine radio history. John finally stirred, a slow, deliberate movement. He reached for the spare microphone, his hands steady, yet a tremor of something profound, something deeply personal, visible in his eyes. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was no casual chat. Elvis, the king, was calling for a reason, an unspoken message, a shared burden only they could comprehend. "Put him through, David," John said, his voice low, a strange blend of resignation and a flicker of the old defiance. "It's about time we had a chat, isn't it?" The secret was not just the call itself, but the unspoken history it represented. The two most influential figures in rock and roll, separated by genre, by geography, by the very nature of their fame, now connected by an invisible thread across the airwaves. It was a revelation of a hidden fraternity, a shared understanding of the isolating crown of legend. And John's reaction, a raw, unfiltered blend of shock, defiance, and a profound hidden vulnerability, left the seasoned radio host utterly silent, witnessing a moment that would forever alter the narrative of that night. The air in the studio crackled, thick, with an almost unbearable tension. David, the host, sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, his carefully constructed professional demeanor shattered. John, however, had found a strange calm. The initial shock had given way to a steely resolve, a readiness to face whatever phantom Elvis had conjured across the airwaves. He picked up the microphone, his gaze fixed on the blinking red light, a portal to a past he thought he had mastered. "Hello, Elvis," John said, his voice surprisingly steady, a hint of the old Liverpudlian coolness returning. "To what do we owe this unexpected pleasure?" The sarcasm was a shield, a familiar weapon, but it carried an underlying current of something deeper, something akin to apprehension. Elvis's voice, now clearer, filled the studio, carrying a weight that transcended mere words. "Pleasure, John? I reckon that depends on what you call pleasure these days. For some of us, it's just surviving." The drawl was slow, deliberate, each word a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through the silence. "Heard you on the radio, talking about the burdens of being a legend. Figured I might have a thing or two to add to that sermon." The conversation, broadcast live to thousands, was no longer an interview. It was a private, yet public dialogue between two titans, a clash of two distinct worlds. The conflict was not overt, but subtle, a dance of veiled meanings and unspoken truths. Elvis, the king of rock and roll, the embodiment of American dream and excess, was calling out John, the rebel, the prophet of peace, on his own turf. "Burdens, Elvis?" John countered, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You should know a thing or two about burdens, shouldn't you? The crown you wear, it's a heavy one, heavier than most." He was referring not just to fame, but to the whispers, the rumors, the darker stories that clung to Elvis's later years, the isolation, the struggles. It was a challenge, an acknowledgement of their shared gilded cages. "Heavy indeed, John," Elvis replied, his voice losing some of its earlier amusement, a deeper, more somber tone emerging. "And sometimes the heaviest part ain't the crown itself, but the silence that comes with it. The silence from those who should understand." He paused, and the silence on the airwaves was deafening. "I heard you talking about loneliness, about the way the world sees you, but never truly knows you. Does that sound about right?" John's jaw tightened. This was the crux of the tension. Elvis was not calling to argue or to reminisce about old times. He was calling to connect on a level few others could comprehend. He was speaking to the profound isolation that came with their unique positions, the secret burden of being perpetually misunderstood, even by those who adored them. "It sounds familiar, Elvis," John admitted, his voice softening, the sarcasm fading. "Too familiar, perhaps." He glanced at David, the host, who sat utterly transfixed, a silent witness to this unprecedented exchange. The raw honesty, the unexpected vulnerability from both men was palpable. "Familiarity breeds contempt, they say," Elvis mused, a dry chuckle in his voice. "But sometimes, John, familiarity also breeds understanding. A kind of understanding that ain't found in headlines or record sales." He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice was imbued with a profound, almost melancholic weight. "We walk a lonely road, you and I. Different paths, maybe, but the same destination. A pedestal, high above the rest, where the air is thin and the company scarce." The words hung in the air, a stark, undeniable truth. The tension in the studio was no longer about conflict, but about the profound, almost tragic connection between these two legends. Elvis was revealing a secret, not about himself, but about their shared destiny, a burden of isolation that only another king could truly comprehend. John, listening, felt the weight of it, the chilling recognition of a truth he had tried to outrun. The conversation was developing into something far more than an interview. It was a communion of two souls, bound by the isolating crown of legend, played out live for the entire world to hear. The air in the studio was thick with unspoken history, with the raw, exposed nerves of two legends laid bare. Elvis's words, "We walk a lonely road, you and I, where the air is thin and the company scarce," had struck John with the force of a physical blow. He felt a profound, chilling recognition, a truth he had spent years trying to articulate, now spoken by the very man he had once dismissed as a relic. This was the climax, the moment where the carefully constructed facades of both men threatened to crumble, revealing the raw, vulnerable humanity beneath. "Scarce indeed, Elvis," John finally responded, his voice barely above a whisper, devoid of all sarcasm, all defiance. Sometimes you wonder if there's any company at all. Just echoes." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of his own isolation pressing down on him. He had always seen himself as the intellectual, the artist, distinct from the showman. But Elvis, in his unexpected call, was revealing the shared prison of their fame, the commonality of their gilded cages. "Echoes, John," Elvis affirmed, his voice now softer, more intimate, as if speaking only to John, despite the thousands listening. "And sometimes, those echoes, they can drive a man mad. Make him forget who he is or who he was meant to be." He paused, and the silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken pain, with the ghosts of their respective struggles, their public battles, their private demons. "I called, John, because I heard you, heard the loneliness in your words, even when you tried to hide it with wit. I know that sound. It's a familiar tune." This was the darkest moment for John. Elvis, the king, was not just acknowledging his pain. He was mirroring it, reflecting a vulnerability John had desperately tried to conceal from the world, and perhaps even from himself. The secret burden he carried was not just the isolation of fame, but the profound, almost unbearable weight of being constantly observed, constantly judged, constantly expected to be more than human. He had built walls, not just around his home, but around his heart, believing that distance could protect him. But Elvis, with a single phone call, had breached those walls, exposing the raw, aching truth of his soul. "What do you want from me, Elvis?" John asked, his voice cracking, a tremor of raw emotion escaping him. Absolution? A shared lament? What is it you truly seek? The question was not aggressive, but desperate, a plea for understanding in a moment of profound exposure. I seek connection, John, Elvis replied, his voice imbued with a deep, melancholic sincerity. A moment of truth between two men who know what it's like to stand on top of the world and still feel utterly alone. A moment to remind each other that we're not just legends, not just symbols. We're just men, trying to make sense of it all. He paused, and then his voice dropped to a near whisper, a confession broadcast to the world. And sometimes, John, even a king needs to hear that he's not the only one drowning in the silence. And in that decisive moment, John Lennon broke. The carefully constructed facade, the cool defiance, the intellectual distance, it all crumbled. He understood. He truly understood. Elvis was not calling to challenge him, but to share a burden, to offer a hand across the chasm of their extraordinary lives. The tears that welled in John's eyes were not just for himself, but for Elvis, for the shared tragedy of their isolating crowns. He saw not just the king, but the man, vulnerable and exposed, reaching out for a lifeline. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Elvis," he managed to say, the words barely audible, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "Thank you for that." The radio host, David, sat utterly silent, tears now streaming down his own face, witnessing a moment of profound, unexpected grace. The climax was not a clash, but a communion, a raw, human connection between two titans, broadcast live, leaving 10,000 people stunned, and revealing the true, empathetic heart beating beneath the legend. The airwaves, usually a conduit for controlled narratives, now carried the raw, unfiltered emotion of two legends. John's "Thank You, Elvis" resonated with a profound sincerity that left the radio host David utterly speechless, tears streaming down his face. The studio, once a sterile environment, was now charged with an almost sacred energy. This was the immediate consequence of Elvis's call, the shattering of John's carefully constructed emotional walls, and the revelation of a vulnerability he rarely allowed the world to see. Elvis, sensing the shift, the profound connection that had been forged, allowed a moment of silence to hang on the line. Then, his voice, now lighter, almost playful, returned. "Well, John, I reckon that's enough heavy talk for one night. Don't want to make your audience too melancholic, do we?" A chuckle, dry and knowing, followed. "Just wanted to make sure you knew you ain't alone out there. None of us are, really, even when it feels like it." "No, Elvis," John replied, his voice still thick with emotion, but a faint smile now touching his lips. "I suppose not. Thank you for the reminder." He glanced at David, who was still struggling to compose himself, wiping his eyes. The host, a veteran of countless interviews, had been transformed from an objective observer into a deeply moved participant. "All right then, John," Elvis said, his voice now signaling a departure. "You get back to your interview, and you keep making that beautiful noise. The world still needs it. And take care of yourself, you hear?" "You too, Elvis," John responded, his voice imbued with a genuine warmth. "You too. And thank you. Truly." With a soft click, the line went dead. The red light on the console ceased its blinking. The silence that followed was profound, different from any silence before. It was not empty, but filled with the echoes of a conversation that had transcended time, fame, and expectation. John sat for a long moment, microphone still in hand, gazing at the now darkened phone light. The transformation in him was palpable. The weary intensity in his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet reflection, a profound sense of having been seen, truly seen, by someone who understood the unique burden of his existence. The secret burden of isolation, though not entirely lifted, had been shared, acknowledged, and for a moment, eased. David, finally finding his voice, cleared his throat, his eyes still glistening. "John, I don't even know what to say." That was unprecedented. John simply nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Some things, David, don't need words. They just are." He took a deep breath, a lightness in his posture that hadn't been there before. The protagonist, John Lennon, had been profoundly affected. The unexpected call from Elvis, a phantom from a different era, had forced him to confront his own vulnerability, to acknowledge the shared humanity that existed even among the most isolated of legends. He continued the interview, but his demeanor was subtly changed. His answers were deeper, more reflective, imbued with a newfound sense of connection. He spoke of the importance of reaching out, of the courage it took to admit loneliness, even for those who seemed to have everything. The consequences of Elvis's call were not just a memorable radio moment, but a profound internal shift for John, a reminder that even kings need to be seen, to be heard, to be connected. The interview, which had begun as a dissection of a legend, had ended as a testament to the enduring, fragile power of human connection, broadcast live to a silent, stunned world. The radio show concluded, not with a flourish, but with a quiet, almost reverent fade-out. The airwaves, once buzzing with the impossible conversation, now carried only the soft hum of the station's outro music. John Lennon left the studio that night a changed man. The encounter with Elvis, a phantom from a different era, had peeled back layers of his own defenses, reminding him of the profound, shared isolation that came with their unique crowns. The secret truth of their intertwined destinies, of the unspoken fraternity of legends, had been laid bare for all to hear. David, the radio host, would forever carry the memory of that night. It was the interview that redefined his career, not for its journalistic prowess, but for its raw, unscripted humanity. He would often recount the story, his voice still tinged with awe, of how two titans, separated by genre and ego, had found common ground in their shared vulnerability. The silence he had experienced, the profound impact of that call, became a benchmark for every interview that followed, a reminder that beneath the celebrity, there always beat a human heart. For John, the call was a catalyst. It didn't erase his past struggles or solve all his internal conflicts, but it offered a profound validation. He understood with a new clarity that the loneliness he felt was not a personal failing, but an inherent part of the path he had chosen, a burden shared by others who walked in similar blinding light. He continued to create, to live, but with a subtle shift in perspective, a deeper empathy for those who, like him, carried the weight of the world on their shoulders. The conversation with Elvis, though brief, had forged an invisible bond, a quiet understanding that transcended the public narrative. Years later, long after the voices of both John and Elvis had been silenced by the relentless march of time, the bootleg recordings of that radio interview would surface. They would become treasured artifacts, not just for their historical significance, but for the raw human truth they captured. Listeners would hear not just two legends, but two men grappling with the profound complexities of their existence, reaching out across the airwaves for a moment of shared understanding. The studio, now dark and empty, stands silent. The microphones, cold and unfeeling, await the next voice, the next story. But the echoes of that night linger, a testament to the unpredictable power of connection, to the way fate can weave the lives of even the most disparate souls into a single profound tapestry. And the question remains, suspended in the quiet hum of memory. What if, in our own lives, when we feel most isolated, most burdened by the weight of our own unique paths, we dared to reach out? What if, like Elvis, we made that unexpected call, or like John, we chose to answer, to acknowledge the shared humanity that binds us all, even across the vast, isolating distances of our lives. For in that choice, in that moment of profound, unexpected connection, lies the true power to stun, to transform, and perhaps to remind us all that even the kings, the legends, the prophets are just men trying to make sense of it all and forever searching for a voice that truly understands. The airwaves, after all, are always open, waiting for the next truth to be broadcast, the next secret to be revealed.